If you saw a dog waiting outside the basilica every morning, rain or shine, you'd think he belonged to someone inside. But the truth was deeper and more heartbreaking. After the Pope passed away, a small brown mutt appeared at the church doors, sitting silently, eyes fixed on the entrance. No one knew where he came from, but he never left. Father Matteo first noticed the dog 3 days after the funeral, curled up near the columns despite the cold marble beneath him. The guards tried to shoo him away gently, but he returned each dawn, his gaze scanning every robe that passed. He didn't bark. He simply waited. And in his waiting, something sacred stirred. Before the Pope fell ill, he used to walk through the gardens in early hours, alone except for a dog that had begun following him months earlier. The Pope never spoke of it publicly, but witnesses recalled how he'd stop, kneel, and scratch behind the dog's ears with quiet affection. "My little pilgrim," he called him once, unaware a nun had overheard. They said the dog started showing up around the Vatican after a storm, muddy and limping, clearly abandoned. The Pope insisted he stay. "He needs peace too," he reportedly told a hesitant aide. No one dared argue, and so the dog became part of his silent rituals, walking beside him, waiting outside Mass, never crossing the sacred lines. Now, with his companion gone, the dog remained at the doors as if expecting the papal robes to emerge once more. Some tourists mistook him for a stray. Others took photos, moved by his eyes, full of something that felt like prayer. The Swiss guards began leaving scraps of bread nearby, though the dog barely touched them. Each night, just before the bells rang to close the gates, he would rise, sniff the air, and slowly retreat behind a column, disappearing into the shadows. And each morning there he was again, seated like a sentry of grief, his patience unbroken. His quiet defiance became something people started whispering about. One of the younger guards, Luca, admitted he'd begun praying beside the dog. "It's like he knows something we don't," he whispered to Father Matteo. "He's waiting for more than just a man." Matteo, older and weary, just nodded. There was something holy in the way the dog refused to forget. Soon, the local parishioners began leaving candles near the steps where the dog sat. An old woman came with a blanket, tucking it gently beneath him. A child drew a picture of the Pope and the dog holding hands and taped it to the gate. The image stayed up for days, fluttering softly in the wind. But on the 7th morning, something shifted. The dog wasn't at his usual spot. The guards looked around, unsure whether to feel worried or relieved. Luca even walked around the gardens, calling softly, "Pellegrino?" the name the Pope had once used. There was no answer, just silence and the echo of church bells. Then a faint sound came from the side chapel, a soft whimper, followed by the tap of nails on stone. The dog had moved, and where he was found would change everything. They found him curled beneath the altar of the side chapel, the same chapel where the Pope had once gone to pray in solitude. His body trembled slightly, not from fear, but as if he sensed something sacred in the space. When Luca stepped closer, the dog looked up with eyes full of silent questions, and behind those eyes was a weight too deep to ignore. The guards weren't supposed to allow animals inside, especially not near the altar. But in that moment, no one had the heart to remove him. The priest who discovered him simply whispered a blessing and let the dog stay. Word spread fast among the staff. "The Pope's dog has chosen where to grieve." Father Matteo stood by the doorway, watching the small creature rest his head on the marble floor. "He never stopped following him," the priest murmured, his voice tight. "Even now, for many, it was a poetic image, but for Luca, it was something heavier, a quiet plea from a soul that didn't understand loss. They tried to coax the dog out, offering food, treats, even soft hands. But he only left the chapel when the organ began to play, walking toward the sound with ears slightly raised. One nun noticed he always stopped at the same pew, the one where the Pope had last sat during Vespers, as if he remembered. His body showed signs of wear, a small cut on the leg, patches of fur missing from his back. The Vatican medic was brought in to check him, surprised by the dog's gentle stillness. "He's exhausted," he said softly. "But not just physically. He's mourning, just like we are." It stunned everyone how human it felt. Questions began to rise. Could they keep him? Was it safe? Would it dishonor the space? But no one dared move him again. The chapel had become his sanctuary, and slowly it also became a place where mourners came not only to pray, but to sit with the animal who had known the Pope more intimately than most humans. One morning, Luca found the dog limping worse than usual. A thorn had lodged deep in his paw. He knelt, carefully pulling it out, expecting resistance, but the dog simply watched him, eyes steady. "You trust me now, huh?" Luca said, tears suddenly forming. The dog licked his hand. That was the first time, but allowing him to stay wasn't without tension. A senior bishop raised concerns about hygiene and protocol. "It's a chapel, not a kennel," he scoffed. The Pope wouldn't have approved this. Yet Father Matteo disagreed. He would have seen the soul, not the fur. The debate divided the clergy. A vote was nearly called to have the dog removed, but just before the meeting, an envelope arrived. Inside was a handwritten note from the Pope, found among his private belongings. It read, "If anything should happen to me, make sure the little pilgrim is not alone. He understands more than we think." The note silenced the room. Even the skeptical bishop had no argument. "Well," he sighed, folding the paper carefully, "then we have our answer." From that day forward, the dog became more than a presence. He became a symbol of fidelity, of loss, of something beyond doctrine. Still, not all reactions were warm. A Vatican cleaner refused to enter the chapel. "It's unnatural," she muttered. "Animals don't mourn like this." But an elderly cardinal corrected her. "Grief is not limited to language. That dog's heart is broken, and broken hearts belong in church." One rainy afternoon, a small group of children entered the chapel, drawn by stories they'd heard. When they saw the dog, lying beneath a stained glass window, they sat around him in silence. One little girl offered her rosary. He sniffed it gently, then rested his head on her lap. She didn't move for 20 minutes. The guards began rotating shifts, not just for security, but to check on the dog. Luca took the night shifts. He found peace in it, even bringing a blanket and laying it beside him. They'd sit together in the candlelight, neither needing words. "I think he's teaching me how to listen," Luca once said to Matteo. Weeks passed. The dog's wounds began to heal, but his routine never changed. He still sat by the basilica doors at dawn, still walked toward the organ, still curled beneath the altar before night. It was no longer strange. It was expected. He had become part of the church's rhythm, part of its loss. One night, as the basilica emptied, the dog didn't rise to leave. He stayed by the pew, resting his head against the wood, breathing slowly. Luca approached, concerned. But instead of moving, he knelt beside him, laying a hand on his back. "You're waiting for someone who's not coming," he whispered. "But maybe you're not alone anymore." And in that moment, Luca made a quiet decision. He would take responsibility for the dog, not just as a guard, but as a companion. "He needs someone to wait with," he said to Father Matteo. "And so do I." The priest only smiled, placing a hand on his shoulder. "Then it seems you've both found what you were missing." The next morning, for the first time, the dog didn't return to the chapel alone. Luca walked beside him, leash in hand, though it hung loose. The guards at the gate gave a small nod, already used to the sight. But something was different now. The dog looked less like a mourner and more like a guide, as if he had accepted something. Luca had taken him in overnight, giving him a soft bed near the window. At first, the dog paced, unsettled, maybe confused. But after an hour, he curled up by the foot of Luca's couch and slept deeply, without interruption. It was the first peaceful night either of them had in weeks, and Luca knew this was no longer temporary. At the Vatican, no formal announcement was made, but word quietly spread. The Pope's companion had found a new path and a new protector. Pilgrims now came not only for the basilica's grandeur, but to glimpse the humble dog who once walked beside holiness. Many said they felt closer to God when they saw him. One family from Argentina brought flowers not for a saint, but for the animal. "He taught us what loyalty looks like," the father said. His young son leaned in to whisper to the dog, who licked his hand in reply. "He listens better than most grown-ups." The boy laughed. The dog wagged his tail, a rare gesture. Even the skeptical bishop, who once argued for his removal, began stopping by in the early evenings. He never spoke, but always left behind a crust of bread and a silent bow. Perhaps it wasn't a full change of heart, but it was something. The dog had softened corners even scripture couldn't reach. Luca started journaling. Not for the public, not for history, just for himself. He wrote about the way the dog stood quietly during morning mass, about how he would tilt his head during music, or how he'd pause beside strangers who were crying. "He senses the broken," Luca wrote, "and he stays with them." The chapel where the dog first hid was renamed unofficially among staff La Cappella del Cane Fedele, The Chapel of the Faithful Dog. No plaque, no sign. But everyone knew it. Tourists asked for it by name. Some wept upon entering, not fully understanding why. Maybe it wasn't about the dog. Maybe it was about what he represented. A journalist visiting from Germany asked for an interview with Luca. He refused. "It's not about me," he said simply. "It's about him," and the man he waited for. The story ran anyway, but with no names, no photos. Just a drawing of the dog beneath stained glass. It went viral overnight. One afternoon, Luca found the dog waiting beside a blind woman near the entrance. She had dropped something. He was gently nudging it toward her foot. When she knelt to pet him, she smiled. "I lost my husband last year," she said. "I haven't cried in months, until now." The dog stayed by her side for an hour. A Vatican physician stopped Luca one day. "That animal," he said, "has a healing presence. Not just emotionally. There's something else. It's like people breathe easier around him." Luca didn't have an answer, but he'd felt it too. The dog had become a silent balm for wounds no medicine could reach. On Palm Sunday, the dog walked up the main aisle during procession, uninvited, unnoticed until he sat at the altar steps. The entire congregation fell silent. The priest paused, then continued. Voice gentler, steadier. No one moved the dog. They let him stay. Some say it was the most moving Mass of the year. Father Matteo began including the dog in his homilies, not by name, but by symbol. "Grief does not end," he preached, "but it can be carried with grace. And sometimes in silence we find our teachers." The congregation knew who he meant. Some nodded, others quietly wiped their eyes. Luca's own life began to shift. He found himself waking earlier, walking lighter. He spoke more kindly to strangers. At night he read aloud, something he hadn't done since childhood, just so the dog wouldn't feel alone. It was strange, he thought, how a creature with no voice could bring such clarity to a man lost in routine. By summer, the dog's fur had grown back. The limp was barely noticeable, and though his eyes still carried the weight of loss, there was warmth in them now. He played, occasionally, with children in the square. He even barked once, sharp and clear, at a tourist who tried to chase a pigeon too roughly. It made everyone laugh. But perhaps the most touching moment came quietly, without fanfare. Luca returned from a short trip home, unsure if the dog would remember. As he crossed into the square, the dog looked up from the steps, froze, then sprinted toward him with unexpected energy. Luca knelt just in time, and the embrace that followed said everything. By autumn, the dog had a nameplate. Not official, but gifted by a child who visited every Sunday. It read Pellegrino, just like the Pope had once whispered. The small tag hung from a simple collar Luca had bought, worn smooth from countless hands that had reached out to touch it, a symbol of presence, of continuity, of a journey that hadn't ended. The Vatican staff adjusted quietly to his presence. Schedules shifted to include his meals. Doors were kept open longer, just in case Pellegrino wandered in late. It was unspoken, but understood that he was more than a pet. He was a keeper of memory, of the Pope's humanity, of the quiet grief no ritual could resolve. Every morning, Luca and Pellegrino walked the perimeter of the gardens, retracing the path once shared with the late Pope. The trees, the benches, the soft gravel walk, it had all become sacred ground now. Sometimes they stopped. Sometimes they didn't. What mattered was the silence they shared. No words, just breath. At noon, Pellegrino would sit by the fountain near the basilica steps, not for show, not for treats, just to sit, to sit, to sit, to soft gravel walk. It had all become sacred ground now. Sometimes they stopped. Pilgrims came and went, some kneeling beside him, others just watching from afar. One elderly woman called her daughter in tears. "I feel like I've seen a saint," she whispered. A small one, with fur. Back at Luca's quarters, the changes were even more subtle. A second food bowl, a folded blanket near the radiator, scratches on the door from excited greetings. But the real shift was in Luca himself. He started sleeping better, smiling more, writing letters to his estranged brother. Pellegrino didn't fix him. He just reminded him to live. Father Matteo noticed. "He's helping you," he said one night during Vespers. Luca nodded. "He doesn't ask me for anything, but somehow I give him everything." Matteo smiled. "That's how grace works. It asks nothing, and yet it changes you." Pellegrino lay beside them, gently snoring. One afternoon, a reporter asked if Pellegrino could be included in an official Vatican publication. Luca declined, but suggested something else. "Tell people to be kind to the ones who wait," he said. "The ones at the door. The ones who never stopped hoping." The article ran with that quote, and it became a viral message of faith. Inspired by the story, churches across Italy began allowing animals into their courtyards, even hosting small blessings for rescued pets. A bishop in Florence wrote, "We learned from Rome that sometimes the purest devotion doesn't wear robes. It walks on four legs, quietly." Pellegrino had started a quiet revolution of compassion. One rainy evening, a homeless man was found sleeping near the basilica wall, soaked and shivering. Pellegrino was beside him, curled into his side, warming him with his body. Luca rushed out with a blanket, helped the man into shelter. The man wept. "I thought I didn't matter," he said. "But that dog, he saw me." Pellegrino became a companion to many, but a symbol to all. People left letters at the chapel, prayers, confessions, drawings. Some were addressed to God, others to the Pope, a few simply to the dog who waited, and all of them felt heard, not by words but by presence, stillness, loyalty. Years passed. Pellegrino aged, his fur whitened around the face. His steps grew slower, but he still walked with Luca each morning, still lay beneath the altar at night. The chapel had become his home, not because he chose it, but because it had chosen him. And in choosing him, it had chosen hope. On the anniversary of the Pope's passing, a special mass was held. Bishops, guards, pilgrims, they all gathered, and in the front pew, Pellegrino sat beside Luca, quiet and still. When the choir began, the dog lifted his head slightly, ears twitching. It was the same hymn the Pope once hummed to him in the gardens. That night, Pellegrino passed in his sleep. No pain, no sound, just a slow, peaceful breath beneath the chapel window. Luca found him curled against the stone, body warm, expression serene. He didn't cry, not right away. He simply sat, hand on fur, heart full. The next day, the Vatican bells rang a little longer. A small plaque was placed inside the chapel. He waited. He stayed. He healed. Tourists still ask about it. Locals still light candles. And Luca, now older, quieter still, walks the garden paths every morning, as if someone walks beside him. Because in the end, Pellegrino didn't just wait for the Pope. He waited for the world to remember what faith looks like, when it has four legs, a silent heart, and refuses to walk away.